Feel about miracles. Now, miracles are funny things. By definition, they are rare. They happen very seldom. I thought I'd make a little parable. Imagine you went into work this week and discovered that one of your coworkers isn't there. And they're not there because you heard that they won the lottery. And you thought, oh, my friend won the lottery. That's good news. So then you call your friend, you say, congratulations, you won the lottery. And she says, yeah, and you won't believe how I won it. Well, how did you win it? Because you knew your friend had some financial trouble, that they were maybe losing their house, and things weren't going well with the kids, and they were in real trouble, so the winning of the lottery was a huge thing. And your friend said, yeah, I went to church on Sunday, and I told my pastor, they're about to take away my house, and I don't have any money, and I can't feed my kids, and please pray for me. And the pastor said, I'd pray for you. And then I went home, and I went to sleep, and in the night, the Lord gave me the numbers. And I went right out to the AM, PM, and I bought the lottery ticket, and I won. Now, would that change how you felt about your friend winning the lottery? And how would it change? Because on one hand, you'd be like, if you just won the lottery seemingly out of dumb luck, you'd say, oh, that's awesome. Nobody ever wins the lottery. But if she won the lottery because she talked to her pastor and then she had a dream and God gave her the numbers, well, how would that make you feel? Because don't you have bills that are hard to pay? Why did God give her the numbers and not you? You see, miracles are a really funny thing because a lot of what last week we talked about Bart Campolo a little bit and Bart's deconversion. And part of the thing when people read the Bible that they have a lot of questions about are miracles, because they read the miracles and say, well, I don't believe miracles can happen. But actually most Americans do believe in miracles. And most Americans, if you kind of lump Americans into two camps, there's kind of the materialists who are kind of hardcore people that say all there is physics and the kind of reality that we can study with science and none of that other stuff. All that other stuff is just sentimentality. Actually, studies say that something like 80 to 90% of Americans are not really hardcore materialists. They like believing in other things, and some are spiritual and not religious, and some are parts of various religious traditions that have supernatural ideas, and so people are really all over the map when it comes to miracles, and so that's why when they do TV shows like Touched by an Angel, or miracle stories are always really popular, including stories about life after death. Most people find it rather grim to imagine that when you die, you're just done. So I know a lot of people who are skeptics and atheists, but I've yet to meet one who will go up to a funeral and say, why don't we all just shut up because they're dead and gone, finished. Nobody says that at a funeral. Even your ardent skeptic will come in and try and say something nice like, well, at least they're in a better place. So, it's about as vague of an answer as you can possibly give. And so most people, when you say miracles, yeah, I believe in miracles. I believe miracles can happen. And when something bad happens to me, I'll look for a miracle. But here's the thing. Imagine you and your neighbor have the same disease, and you and your neighbor went to the same church, and you and your neighbor have the same pastor pray for you, and what if your neighbor got healed and you didn't? How would you feel about that miracle? Now you might want to say, well, I would celebrate them. Yeah, I'm sure we all want to be that magnanimous, but there's a little part in us that would say, why did God heal them and not me? Now, see, miracles kind of offend us for a number of reasons. Philosophers today will talk about the buffered self, which basically means that by virtue of our culture right now, we feel pretty independent. If you look at the ancient world, if you look at the Greeks, Eros was a god. Why? Because when you fall in love, it feels like an alien power has possessed you. And for some of you young people out there, you'll know this because you'll have a friend who falls in love, and they used to be your friend, but now all they pay attention is their beloved, and you feel abandoned by them. And then maybe they'll break up, and they'll come back to your group of friends all sheepishly and say, well, here I am. And they're all scornful towards you because you abandoned them, and you say, yeah, but I fell in love. What could I do? That's a very Greek way of thinking about it, that things possess us. But in the contemporary world, we have our psychology and our other ideas, and we think, I'm in control of me. Things don't possess me. That's what's called by philosophers the buffered self. God doesn't intrude or disrupt my world. And so then we get into what we call moralistic therapeutic deism, where we say, well, I'm kind of in charge of me, but if I get into a scrape, if the tax man gives me a big bill at the end of the year, well, then I'll pray, Lord, send some money. And I expect God to come to my rescue. In other words, for the most part, I want God to kind of stay out of it. I can manage my life fine. But if I get in a pinch, then I want God to rescue me. And that's actually, I think, how most Americans manage their own spiritual lives. One of probably the best books you've never read is a book by an English writer. She was a contemporary and a friend, actually, of C.S. Lewis named Dorothy Sayers. She was a playwright and an author. She wrote a lot of mystery novels, and she also wrote this book, which is kind of theological, entitled The Mind and the Maker. And what she explores in this book is God. And it's actually from her that C.S. Lewis got the idea that our relationship with God, often, if I'll talk to an atheist friend of mine, they'll say, there is no God. You can't find God. You can't go to his address and lay hands on him. And Dorothy Sayers makes the point. She says, that isn't how God is related to us. Because it's kind of like asking Frodo and Sam to find J.R.R. Tolkien, or asking Luke Skywalker to find George Lucas. That's much more the relationship we have with God than going up into outer space and finding him in the heavens. That's not really how things work. So Dorothy Sayers says basically, our relationship with God is much more like a character in a story's relationship with the author. But reality is a special kind of story. And she begins her chapter 5 with two interesting quotes from two very different authors. One says, God created man in his own image and likeness. In other words, made him a creator too. And when we celebrate the gifts of music that we have on stage in the morning, God made all of these musicians creative. And so Pete is playing around, and we've got this old hymn that we sang in CRC churches, I sought the Lord. It was always kind of a down tune. And Pete says, well, let's play around with it and see if we can. Well, Pete's doing like his Father in heaven. He's being creative, and this is what we were made to do. And so on one hand, God is our author, but he wrote us to be the kinds of creatures that are like him in terms of being creative. So, in other words, made him a creator too, calling him to free, spontaneous activity and not to formal obedience to his power. Free creativeness is the creature's answer to the great call of its creator. Man's creative work is the fulfillment of the Creator's secret will. In other words, God made us like we are, not just playing out a script, kind of like Frodo is subject to Tolkien, but we're a special kind of novel where we're more alive. And in fact, Somerset Maugham, who was himself an atheist, has the second quote here that Sayers shines some more light onto it. A character in a writer's mind, unwritten, remains a possession. His thoughts recur to it constantly, and while his imagination gradually enriches it, he enjoys the singular pleasure of feeling that there, in his mind, someone is living a varied and tremendous life, obedient to his fancy, and yet in a queer, willful way, independent of him. What Mom is kind of responding to, as many authors do, and as Dorothy Sayers does, in fact, with her mystery novels, you start writing a character in a story, and that character starts to come alive in the story. And you all know this when you read books or watch movies. If a character does something outside of the character and without any kind of cogent transformation within the story, all the readers and watchers of the movie look at it and say, the writer, they messed up that character. They weren't following the story of the character. In other words, the characters take on lives of their own. And Somerset Maugham was basically saying, isn't it a funny thing that when we write fiction, our characters take on a different life? Now, what happened with Dorothy Sayers actually is she kind of fell in love with one of her characters. And so in one of her stories, what she actually did was write herself into the novel, so she could have a relationship with that character that she fell in love with. Now, you think about that and think, oh, that sounds kind of weird. But it's kind of interesting, too. Now, the stories this morning, coming from 2 Kings, which is what we're going through, are a couple of miracle stories from Elisha. And now, as we read these two stories, I want you to think about Jesus. And I want you to think about the conversation that we're having throughout the Bible and think about how these stories work. The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 sons as his slaves." Because in the ancient world, today, if you default on a loan, they give you a bad credit score. In the ancient world, if you default on your loan, they come and take your children, or you, until you pay it back as their slaves. So here's someone in the company of the prophets of Elisha, and the guy died, and he left a lot of debt, and the debtors are coming to take his sons to repay the debt. And the widow is saying, "Elisha, you're my patron, help me." Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you? Tell me what you have in your house." "Your servant has nothing there at all," she said, "except a small jar of olive oil." Elisha said, "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask them for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." She left him and shut the doors behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. Then all the jars were full. And she said to her son, "Bring me another one." But he replied, "There's not a jar left." And at this point, she's like, "Shoot, I should have got more jars." Then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, "Go and sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on what is left." Now, on one hand, this is a great story, and this is a great miracle, and this is a wonderful thing, because here this poor woman who was about to lose her sons, well, now she can sell this olive oil and pay all the debts and have money to live on. Well, this is wonderful, and we're happy for her. But then the more we think about this, we begin to think other things. One of the things you notice right away is that this reminds us of the story of Elisha, or Elijah. And so you're saying, oh, what's going on here in the book of Kings? But what occurs to us very quickly is, well, shoot, we're all capitalists at heart. If you get a miracle like this, well, then you should get some vats and keep pouring oil in the vats. And then pretty soon the company of prophets can have a cottage industry and none of them will have to work. I mean, don't all our minds just go there? And so then we're kind of like, well, aren't there other poor people there? Don't they need oil? And here's the problem with miracles. If God does one, we want him to do it all the time, don't we? And we especially want him to do it for me. Here's another story. One day Elisha went to Shunammite, and a well-to-do woman was there, who urged him to stay for a meal. So when he came in, he stopped there to eat. She said to her husband, I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put a bed in it and a table, a chair and a lamp for him. Then he can stay here whenever he comes to us. Now again, in the ancient world, this is a patronage relationship. Basically, this woman says, well, certainly the group of Yahweh prophets aren't really in the king's favor anymore, so let's be kind to this man and let's support him because he's doing good things. And so she sets up a room, and whenever he comes through town, he has a place to stay, and this is great. This is wonderful for Elisha and his servant. One day when Elisha came, he went up to his room and laid down there. He said to his servant Gehazi, call the Shunammite. So he called her, and she stood before him. Elisha said to him, tell her, you have gone to all this trouble. And it's really interesting how he's got her standing there, and he's there, and he's talking through his servant. Isn't that interesting? Again, more culture. Elisha said to him, tell her, you have gone through all the trouble for us. Now what can be done for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army? She replied, I have a home among my own people. In other words, she says, I've got a good life. I'm cool. I just want to do something nice for you. Wonderful. What can be done for her? Elisha asked. Gehazi said, she has no son, and her husband is old. Then Elisha said, call her. So he called her, and she stood in the doorway. About this time next year, Elisha said, you will hold a son in your arms. Now pay attention here. This is really telling. No, my Lord, she objected. Please, man of God, don't mislead your servant. What's going on here? Well, clearly, all she's ever wanted was a son. And all she's never had was a son. And so even for Elisha to raise the opportunity, she's like, don't even talk about this. Don't raise my hopes. I would rather never have a son than you to raise my hopes and then have it dashed. What does Elisha do? But the woman became pregnant, and the next year, about that time, she gave birth to a son, just as Elisha had told her. Now we got echoes of Abraham and Sarah. And we have this picture of, well, this woman, out of no necessity, was generous towards Elisha, and in that sense, generous towards God, and God blessed her. And this is a wonderful story. It would be nice to stop the story here, but the story doesn't stop here. The child grew, and one day he went out to his father, who was with the reapers. He said to his father, my head, my head. His father told the servant, carry him to his mother. After the servant had lifted him and carried him to his mother, the boy sat in her lap until noon, and then he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, and then shut the door and went out. She called her husband and said, please send one of the servants and a donkey so I can go to the man of God quickly and return. Why go to him today, he asked. It's not the new moon or the Sabbath. Well, why this interchange in the story? What hasn't she told her husband? Her son is dead. She doesn't tell her husband her son is dead? What's going on? That's all right, she says. She saddled the donkey and said to her servant, lead on. Don't slow down for me unless I tell you. She saddled the donkey, verse 25. So she set out and came to the man of God at Carmel. When he saw her in the distance, the man of God said to the servant, look, there's the Shunammite. Run to her and ask her, are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right? Everything is all right, she tells Gehazi. Why is she lying again? What's going on here? Well, we know this because of what happened earlier. This son means more to her than anything in the world. And part of her never wanted to have a son because she never wanted to have her heart broken. And now he's dead. She can't tell her husband. She can't tell Gehazi. When she reached the man of God at the mountain, she took hold of his feet. Gehazi came over to push her away. What does that sound like? Remember Jesus and the children? No, you shouldn't touch him. No, get away from him. Women aren't supposed to be here and do these kinds of things. Leave her alone. She's in bitter distress, but the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me why. Another interesting detail. God is keeping secrets from the guy he usually lets in the secrets for. Did I ask you for a son, my Lord? She said, didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes? What do we know about this woman? Can you appreciate this literature? Can you appreciate this storyteller? Do you see how much he has told us about this woman by telling us almost nothing? Her whole life she has wanted a child, and she got to the point of no longer wanting to ask God or anyone else. She was going to be stoic and just decided she was going to live in the small confines of her expectation. And Elisha comes in and says, you want a son. And God gives him a son, but now the son is dead, and she's like, I should have stayed a stoic. I shouldn't have opened my heart to miracles. I shouldn't have believed, because that just means I'll be disappointed. Elisha said to Gehazi, tuck your cloak into your belt. Take my staff in your hand and run. Don't greet anyone you meet, and if anyone greets you, do not answer. Lay my staff on the boy's face. And you're thinking, oh gosh, what is this? Lay the staff? I mean, what's going on? But the child's mother said, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. In other words, she's saying, Elisha, you're my connection to God. Whatever happens, this is what I'm hoping for. So he got up and followed her, and Gehazi went ahead and laid the staff on the boy's face. But there was no sound or response, so Gehazi went back to meet Elisha and told him, the boy has not awakened. When Elisha reached the house, there was the boy lying on the bed on his couch. He went in, shut the door on the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and laid on the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. What's this about? Is there some exchange happening? My life for yours? Then he got on the bed and laid on... He stretched himself out on him, and the boy's body grew warm. Elisha turned away and walked back and forth in the room, and then got on the bed and stretched out on him once more. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. What's with the sneezing? Elisha summoned Gehazi and said, call the Shunammite, and he did. And when she came, he said, take your son. She came in, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground, and she took her son and went out. On one hand, this is an amazing story, and I love this story. On another hand, you read the story and you say, how many sons weren't raised? How many children's deaths broke their mothers' hearts? This is at the heart of something that went on in Fuller Seminary when they had in the early 80s a John Wimber course. And Lou Smedes, who's one of the great scholars of the Christian Reformed Church, was on the faculty then. And he wrote some articles, should we celebrate a miracle? Because every time God heals this one person, every time God gives this person the lottery, a million other people look and say, God doesn't answer my prayer. Maybe we should just call the whole thing off. But what really is going on here? We demand that we are the authors of our own story. Frodo wants to say, Tolkien, who are you to me? Oh. Isn't it closer to true that if given a minute's reflection, we see what's really going on in our hearts? Equality is a huge cultural value, and in a sense we say, if I don't get a miracle, no one does. C.S. Lewis, in his great essay, The Grand Miracle, talks about the fact that we are ardent Democrats at heart, and we like to imagine that we all stand equal before God. But is Frodo equal to Sam? Is equal? In some ways they're equal, but they also all have parts to play. Aragorn is Aragorn, and Frodo is Frodo, and Gandalf is Gandalf. And in what way are they equal or not equal? You see, what we imagine is that we all stand before God and God should just what? And Lewis says, if you read the story of the Bible, you find that, well, goodness grief, people are far away from God, and God picks Abraham, and God raises up Israel, but Israel's a disaster. And Lewis makes the point that it all winds up with a Jewish girl at her prayers, and an angel comes to her and says, "You're going to have a son." And she's like, "Wow, I'm not even married, and I'm a little young." And he says, "Don't worry, this is God's instrument." And maybe an older girl with a little more smarts would say, I don't know if I want to be God's instrument. What I really want is a nice husband and a nice home and a good, secure life. And what God gives her is the Son of God, and God lets her know, this is going to break your heart. So suddenly, all the materialists and all the supernaturalists and everyone is on one side. And there's the rest of us that say, God tells us what he does, and he doesn't necessarily do what we want. And this is why miracles offend us. Because kind of like the Shunammite woman says to Elisha, don't get involved in my personal stuff, okay? I've got it managed the way I want it. And God says, I am the author and you are the character, and I'm working on my story. And that's why Frodo says, I wish I had never gotten the ring. And Gandalf says, that's not ours to decide. Then we say, it should be more like nature. And Lewis says, yeah, but nature is exactly this way, isn't it? Who gets cancer, who doesn't get cancer, whose field grows many crops, and who gets hit by the hurricane and gets wiped out. Vast marches of space with no life at all. Vast marches of time where diseases go through and half of Europe is wiped out. Where an empire rises and an entire group of people are lost to genocide. We only mourn the genocides we know about. How many generations of genocides were before that not even their name is remembered? This is the way the world works. And you say you want a God that reflects nature? But you want equality? Nature is not equal. We say we want a God like nature, but we want nature to be a pet, not a lion or a tiger. We can say we can't believe in God because of nature, but then we object to what God does, because God doesn't break the rules that we imagine he should. What we're really upset by is that we're not the authors of our lives, that things happen to us that we don't like, that we can't control. What we really are determined egoists that say to God, my will be done, not yours. And God just says, We don't trust God, the God of miracles, because he reminds us that we are not in control. And then we have to ask, okay, if he's writing the script, and why does he choose? And here's the crazy thing. As Lewis mentions in his book, he says, here's the funny thing about God chooses Abraham. He says, you're going to have a son. And Abraham's like, yes, I've been waiting for a son. And how long does God take to give him a son? 25 years. And it's like, if you can give me a son at all, why don't you give me in year 1, not year 25? And God says, And on and on and on, we read the stories of the Bible, and he's like this. And Lewis says, yeah, to be chosen by God is one heck of a thing. Because when God chooses you, he usually chooses you to suffer. And you think, well, what? Choose someone else. God says, We're chosen to suffer for others. We're chosen to die for others. We're chosen to love his enemies. And we're chosen to have a life be a sacrifice. Elisha gives the woman the oil miracle. He doesn't do it for himself. Wait to hear next week's story. He's offered riches. He says, nah. Gehazi has eyes for it. Hear about that next week. Who does this sound like? It sounds like Jesus. He's chosen to suffer for others. He's chosen to die for others. He's chosen to love his enemies. He's chosen for his life to be a sacrifice. And so you might ask, well, what about me? And you might say, well, how does this fix something? What I really want is to say, Pastor, I need money. And Paul will say, okay, I'll pray for you. And then you go to bed and the Lord says, 6572643. You wake up and you write it down. Because, if you had the dream and you didn't write it down, that's not on me. That's what we want. And God doesn't do it. And then we say, And God says, If God chooses not to perform a miracle for you, he puts you in good company because he's chosen for you to suffer. And you say, well, I don't want to suffer. Well, of course. It's the definition of suffering. And so when Jesus is on Gethsemane, he says, I don't want to suffer. But if you want me to suffer, and if you believe it will do some good, which nobody at that moment would think it would do, Jesus says, I will suffer for you, whether it seems to make sense in the moment or not. And so what we will see is that how we suffer is probably more important than that we suffer. Because the truth is, if you live in this world, you will suffer. His greatest miracle was when death and suffering saved the guilty. He chooses the innocent to die in place of the guilty. And even though we see that happens every day in nature, because he chooses it, it has a totally different outcome. So what about you? Nowhere in the Bible does it say, don't ask for a miracle. In fact, we're told, it's in the Lord's Prayer, keep us from the time of testing. Please ask for a miracle. And if God gives you a miracle, please celebrate it. And I hope I'm mature enough to celebrate it with you. But if you suffer, please know it does not mean that God has abandoned you. But it feels that way. What did Jesus say on the cross? My God, why have you forsaken me? But it's in that moment when all suffering comes to make sense. So, do you want a miracle? Please ask. And if you get a no, please know he still loves you. And is probably doing something with you. Because he is the author, and we are his story. Let's pray. Lord, we all suffer. And none of us like it. And we don't know what to do with it. And Lord, we're like insecure teenagers in relationship with you. Any little thing comes and we feel rejected, or we don't understand, or we don't know what to do. But you are the author, we are the story. You are the sculptor, and we are the clay. Help us to believe. And when we suffer, help us to know that you have called your best tools throughout history to suffer. And so when we suffer, Lord, may we suffer like Jesus and not like Judas. Help us, Lord, to believe. This we ask in the name of Jesus. Amen. Would you stand?